Good morning, class. How are you this fine Thursday morning, this fine Thursday? It has been an eventful 7 days in my neck of the woods, but I'm excited to be back with you today. So, if you're new here, if you're not, if you're an old friend, whoever you are, welcome back to Lady of the Lore. This is your host speaking, your captain speaking, Kelly Ornelas. Don't forget it. Today, I have no quirky funny story to tell you. We're just going to jump right in. Because last week I left off maybe a little abruptly I ended a little abruptly because I was starting to yap and I didn't want to get too far into this week's episode or this week's information, this week's discussion. So, we're going to pick up where we left off. To continue digging into how the things we consume and the narratives or the channels that we subscribe to helped shape our reality, I want to continue digging at how it is discourse that shapes the world around us. And like I said last week, I expected you to be taking notes, so I'm hoping that you can keep up this week. If you didn't, contact a neighbor, contact a friend, get some help on that front because we're going to need it. Some of the trends that we follow, some of the things that come around end up existing as boxes. They exist as categories to fill. And we end up building enclosures around ourselves like a dog kennel. And at some point we begin calling that the way that it is, or the way that life goes, the way things are. It's tradition, how it's always been. And so in doing that, there's no need to go messing it up, right? The old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, discourse, what started as discussions and as YouTube videos or whatever, ideas that started as tweets, when they get enough attention or people with ideas get enough attention that they make their way into your purview as just the way things are or the way life is, heavy on, I'm making air quotes right now and I wish you guys could see me because I'm probably going to spend half of this episode doing so. And I'm hoping that it's conveying in my tone. Last week, we briefly started talking about understanding the bird's eye view of what it means to follow the current, follow the trends. When you really understand the real deep, boiled down foundational principles and histories of different trends or ways of thinking, social media trends, things like that, like saying random made up words or buying 40-ounce metal water receptacles, all of that will start to fit into a larger picture. You have to understand the context, seeing past the thing itself and really understanding the world that it is situated in as well. And really, I feel like I refer to context so much at this point, I need it on a t-shirt or something, a cap. Maybe we should have bumper stickers. We should all have bumper stickers that say, understand the context or know the context. To really understand something's context, a thing's context, why something came to be, how tradition became tradition, it is to really take that step back for all that it's worth and decide whether or not practicing that something or following that certain social trend is something that you actually want to practice. Sometimes we're just following things we don't even know what we're doing. And upon the times that you stand back and you take in that perspective and you realize that perhaps we're living in a country that still needs more, that we need more compassion, more knowledge, more understanding, more respect, more equity, then you see the need, the absolute requirement that you pick up your shield, you pick up your swords, all of these tools that you've gained through understanding, through experiencing the world around us, and you challenge those claims to tradition. And if you don't care to do that, then I would at least ask you, please do not stand in the way of those of us who do want to change these things, who do want to challenge all of these principles that are called tradition and are truthfully made up things, made up by humans. The problem that we're presented with is that we're spending too much time focused on the names and the dates and less on the underrepresented social and cultural developments or the currents across time, across so many different periods. Or when we also, as we've discussed already, are a little too quick to join in those currents as the people who are living and creating history, being caught up and distracted by those things. That's what's going to keep us from tapping into that world that exists past our screens. And otherwise, if we don't do that, we are never going to get to experience how rich that actually is. You know, the things that we call normal or the quote unquote norms and traditions are all things that have been created by us, by humans. And they are reinforced by humans and they're replicated by humans. And the pattern is continued by whom would you dare to guess? Human beings. History is what documents all of that. The things we consider to be our standard or our way of doing things, like our conception of gender dynamics, for a quick example, this is something that I can comfortably dabble in. In a lot of ways, people still operate under a very dated patriarchal structure, a very oppressive social system for not only women, but men as well. Those systems automatically place men in positions of power and authority. In that system, men are the leaders of the family, men are the leaders in the workplace, in the politics, all of it. And on the other hand, you have women who are expected to take on roles that are more domestic or basically just supportive to the patriarch. And the thing is, there are ideas that come attached to these roles about how a person is supposed to be or what role you're supposed to fill. And it supports the idea of a role that you must fill, a duty you must fulfill because it is biologically assigned to you. When human beings are so vastly different, no one category can fit everything that makes up a single person's character. I was actually having a conversation with my mom about this recently, and I was talking about myself, how I find myself in a world where I'm many things, right? Like I'm over here preaching about, against this kind of system that says this, and that about a woman, or what traits I would naturally have as a female. And sometimes when I'm talking about it, I find myself having to defend myself from being categorized as one thing. And I don't know if I'm making this make sense. I'm not very good at that. But I was just talking about how we have people who, okay, women who are feminists, for example, are considered right off the bat, depending on who you're having a conversation with, the word feminist is just going to be like, "Oh, like you're one of those girls," you know? And it's just such a negative thing when all that it really means is, you know, desiring the same rights and the same abilities as the men around me, because there are places and there are rooms in which I belong and in which my experience has brought me to these things and my abilities have brought me to be able to pursue these opportunities, and that I should be able to do so with no regard to the fact that I'm a woman, that I have the body parts that can help me bring a child onto this planet. Obviously not alone, but you catch my drift. On the same side of that coin, I enjoy certain things. Like I have very eh, I have niche interests, as I guess we can call them, things that are instilled primarily in women or things that we consider naturally feminine. But I feel very strongly towards both sides of this. So if I can kind of stand on that middle line, it just blows my mind really, and it really confuses me to understand how we are supposed to confine ourselves to one thing or another. If I personally feel like I can't be defined by one thing, then I can't really imagine the kind of anxiety inducing nightmare it is to try and define who you are if you're not like a heterosexual cis person. But I'm just thinking out loud here at this point. What I'm trying to say is that there are still pieces of this in the United States, and there are theories that explain it. I'm going to link what I'm calling a safe article on this, which is plugged a book that I may or may not have added to my to be read list. That is none of your business. But this article gives you a look into how older societies lived. And in a particular society that belongs to modern day Turkey, but lived in the area some like 9,000 years ago, in this group, individuals were considered gender blind. Women and men looked the same. There was very little physical height difference. They ate the same, lived the same, all of it. And the author also offers other examples in Asian cultures where men were often known to raise their sisters' kids. Or there are other examples also in the article where matriarchal or matriarchal lineages took precedence and were more respected than a father's bloodline. And if you let it, reading this article will kind of force some perspective. And it'll kind of make you think, or it made me think at least, that the way that we do things here in the West, here in America, is not really the end all be all. It's not the only way. It's just the way that we see in our little bubble because we were raised on histories of George Washington, the cherry picker. But according to that same article, and when I say that, I always picture the little girl on Magic School Bus. According to my research, there are several examples of societies where the idea of gender and whatever qualities were so-called naturally attached to one sex made absolutely no difference. Or the difference looked nothing like the structure that we cling to. Like those lineages where we're paying attention to mom's bloodline instead of dad's. That's not what we're used to. I talk about it a lot, but House of the Dragon, like I still get so beside myself when I'm watching it, and I'm thinking, I think his name is Jacaerys, Rhaenyra's eldest son. He gets so upset that he is not his father's trueborn son, or not like Targaryen trueborn, whatever, but he is because she's a Targaryen. So I don't understand, why is it such a big deal if his mom is the Targaryen and very clearly that's his mother? You know, you can't really deny your matronage. So that's how I feel about that. But back to the old societies, the way that they saw gender was different, and that was that until conquest and so forth, where ideologies and philosophies begin to mix and shift and all of that good stuff. The Europeans probably end up at fault because it's always the Europeans. But this structure comes to us here. It's like a disease, a man-made and weaponized disease. And back to that article, one thing that struck me in it was a line that said, quote, "A society made by humans can also be remade by humans." That sat with me because it's basically what I'm trying to convey here, that everything is a farce. Everything is made up. And if it's no longer fitting us, it's like buying new shoes. You know, like if it's no longer fitting you, then let's buy new shoes. I'm always down to buy a new pair of shoes. And it's exactly what has begun to happen. It's what's been taking place, at least in the realm of human rights and of women's rights, for over a century in the United States. The idea of male dominance in both the public and the private spheres has been reinforced through laws and through that notion of tradition, and obviously through social practices that are attached to that tradition, which is something we'll continue getting into later on down the road. But the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries were the markers of some pretty significant turning points in the overall fight for gender equality. And the granting of something so taken for granted as voting rights ends up laying the groundwork for all of the feminist movements that have come after that have chased reproductive rights, and so on and so forth. And please read the article because it talks about how women's sexuality became a thing to control so a man's heir could be proven as such. Back to the House of the Dragons bit. As a man in the world of no DNA test, if you can control who a woman's having sex with, then you know who your wealth and your property, everything you've worked to accumulate over the course of your life, the things you've bled for, like literally Game of Thrones style, everything would be passed to your full-blooded heir. And then obviously, controlling a woman's sexuality has been also tied to moral codes as well. Things like premarital sex, adultery, homosexuality, all of these things were viewed and have continued to be seen as threats to a social order. And it ends up being enforced through laws, through religious teachings, which sometimes are created into laws. And then they create our cultural norms. It creates the current that we live in. Except I don't feel very chill like the turtle on Nemo, which clearly I need to watch that movie again. But it's all so entrenched in the things that we do. Even if you don't really believe yourself to be outright practicing some of these things, we are. We do not even realize it. Gender dynamics, again, using that as an example because it's where I'm comfortable, it's a part of our everyday actions. Like, who's expected to pay for a meal on a date? Exactly. We stick to social scripts. We have made up all kinds of expectations for femininity and masculinity. And where do these come from? They're not just born out of thin air. They evolve. We've established that they evolve, and they have continued to change over time and, remain that way. They continue to change. We are navigating the world, however, wearing rose-colored glasses by not questioning that discursive influence because it shapes our perceptions. It has shaped our perceptions. Everything is like tinted in a different hue, one outside of actuality. And these ingrained dispositions, the things that we cling to as natural, frame the way that we see certain issues, the way that we see certain events. It even frames the way that we respond. And then it also plays a real good bit at downplaying a lot of the negative of it all. The exceptionalism narrative that we've talked about that kind of glosses over the way that a country handles things in the past, the historical injustices or, their present issues even. It paints you this beautiful patriotic picture with eagles flying over it and a flag blowing in the wind. This is what those rose-colored glasses do. And those glasses are discourse, or is discourse. The exchange of ideas, the way that we interpret things, the way we understand. And parts of the picture have been covered up. And what we see and the things we understand are basically all dependent on whoever's in charge or the things around us. It's this structured set of ideas, the narratives and conversations that are shaped by the way people think and speak and understand. And, actually, one good way to think about this is I like to say in the Pinterest way, the way that you say you create your reality, your attitude shapes your reality. If you believe it, it'll be true. And there have got to be probably 100 TED Talks at this point on the power of your words, the power of the mindset, the power of vulnerability, all of that stuff. I've listened to a couple of them. But this is the way that we shape our reality. The ways of thinking that we've been talking about today have legitimized actual power structures. It's presented them as natural, or the way that, at the very least, the way that it's always been, because that becomes a little hard to argue with. Things like ideas that would create any kind of unequal power balance creates tropes like separate but equal, and that used to justify racial segregation. The idea of the traditional family unit or traditional family values has been and is still used to other and to classify LGBTQ relationships as other, to label them as unnatural or as immoral. And the strongest discourses, obviously the biggest opinions, the loudest people, end up shaping the public's perception because it's what you hear the most around you. It builds the world for you, builds the floor underneath you, so to speak. You get stereotypes and ignorance and bias. You don't get real exposure to the diverse realities of multiple people and of all of those characteristics that make us up and make us so unique. Just having a simple conversation with someone who was not raised religious, like where it wasn't even that important of a topic for them, is always such a culture shock for me. In East Texas, in my personal life, Sundays were a church day. There were some businesses growing up who opened later on Sunday mornings because of that exact reason. Liquor stores are closed on Sundays. It's like second nature almost. And then I followed a girl from New Jersey on Instagram who's recently published a book, and she once opened up this random Q&A thing where people ask her questions and she responds on her stories. And one of her followers were curious enough to ask her about her religious background. And her answer was very simple, very straightforward. She said, "Religion isn't a big thing for me." And I swear my jaw dropped. And then she goes on and she explains how I think her father was culturally Jewish and her mother was brought up Catholic, but neither one of her parents placed that great of a premium on religion. And I was like, what? I did not know that was an option. And this is, I don't think I was super far into my degree when I first started following her, but I was like, no way. People like that exist? Is that not heretical? That's not like for real heresy? What? What do you mean it's not a big thing? It's literally the biggest thing. And maybe it is for you. Maybe it was for me. It isn't for her. And there is so many more people like her, more than we think. Even having conversations just about something as simple as gender roles and, simple and not, but having conversations with friends, it depends on their background, their walks of life that really determine how they understand something like this. We just see what's around us in this little bubble and end up thinking that like that's the only thing that exists. When hello, our very Eurocentric histories that we tend to study, written by white men about white men, not very accurate for some of us. Welcome to the bubble for real. If you have your one dominant discourse, then other things seem dangerous or abnormal or out of the ordinary. And then it's made out to be scary. Homosexuality once upon a time was considered a mental illness. It was criminalized. Discourse or, the labeled abnormal discourse influenced actual law. For example, let's look at the 18th and the 17th centuries because people begin talking more openly about sexuality at this point. And this ends up shaping how individuals understood and experienced their desires and then their personal identities. Discourse, again, I hope you guys are sick of this word at the end of this. It's a way that power operates, and it was used to declare what was right, what was the right way to live. And sexuality became a key area of scientific study and of social control. Something that you would think is like a private conversation. It began introducing discussions on it, and that opens the door to having norms like heterosexuality reinforced, and it stigmatizes anything else. It looks down on anything different from these norms. It sounds odd, I know, but as people go on clutching their pearls and start saying, oh, hush, hush, don't talk about these things, they're private, this is bedroom discussion, the more people talk about it. Obviously, society becomes obsessed with sexuality to the point of legislating it. The field of psychiatry becomes infected by this in the 19th and 20th centuries. Psychiatry, which obviously, started as a way to understand and treat mental illnesses, became a social control tool. It was a weapon. Psychiatric institutions were set up to confine people and to treat people who were labeled as mentally ill, but this label came from symptoms like emotional instability, which got many women diagnosed with hysteria. If you sit down and think about it, the psychiatric institutions end up becoming like dog pounds for people who society rejected based on their own social norms, and the doctors become intent on finding out how they can reprogram these people to be proper citizens instead of actually figuring out what might be wrong with these people and if anything at all. So hysteria becomes this diagnosis for a lot of women and an extremely common diagnosis. Being emotional was a sign of weakness. It was a sign of instability in women, and any woman who might not just be extra emotional, but if she challenged any kind of social norm through the rejection of roles, your traditional gender roles, through her sexual behavior, if she had a higher sex drive than normal, through her career ambitions, all of these things, if they challenged the system, it was labeled as hysterical and they were locked up. So there's labels created, and it's used to control them and bring them back in line with what is expected of them. And then they go so far as to begin using electroshock therapy for women who were identifying as lesbian. This was so insane. This was so hysterical, literally. Diagnosing those women with hysteria was a way for that patriarchal society to control them. The women who didn't conform to societal norms were labeled and treated in ways that reinforced their subservience to the men. And these treatments were not to reduce the symptoms. They were not to treat symptoms. They were to keep women in their proper place. And if I remember correctly, I believe not only electroshock therapy was being used, but also sterilization. Women were sterilized for being what they labeled as hysterical. And I am so convinced that they would have locked me up for sure. For sure. Discourse has dictated so much, and we are at risk of doing the same thing and ending up in the same boat if we are not aware of all of these hidden pieces. I want you guys to think on that for the next few days. Think about the connection between discourse and power and reality and the way that we do things, the way that we work, the way we operate, the way we think. Think on some examples of that. Next week, we're going to tap back into it. We're going to explain some more of the ins and outs of discourse. Again, I told you that you would be sick of it, but this is all for a greater purpose. This all has an intention. Discourse is something really extremely important to understand because it can be applied. The theory, the idea, the practice can all be applied to various points in time. It's like understanding the secret recipe to something so that you can make it the same way every time and the most perfect way, whatever you got to do. So we're doing this for an intentional purpose. I promise at the end of this, you will be like, oh, okay, that's why we spent so many freaking episodes on the same topic. We're getting there. Swear. So next week, we're going to dive into some historical examples of discourse and how it connects to the powers that be, how it is the power. So I hope that you'll join me next week. I hope you loved this episode. And if you didn't, hang in there. I swear it will get more interesting. We've just got to get to the bones of it all first. Like I said, bite by bite, that's how the elephant is eaten. If you loved what you heard here today, if you found it interesting, please share it with everyone that you know, your mother, your father, your grandmother. I would love to be in their ear, be the little bug in their ear, teaching them some new things about history and understanding history and bringing us all together over our common story. So, I'll see you next week. Be prepared. Class is officially dismissed. Bye.